First, my name is Fabrizio Maniglio. I'm a QA manager at Lonza. A couple of words about Lonza first. Lonza was founded in 1897 in the south of Switzerland. It's named after a river. We started with doing carbide for gas lamps and then moved and transitioned and grew to be a trusted supplier in pharmaceutical, biotech, and specialty ingredients. We had sales of about 4.13 billion last year, and we have global operations with 40 major sites across the globe and employ a little under 10,000 employees. Me being one of them, I've been dealing with and responsible for data integrity for now the past 2 years. And today I would like to share my journey with you. So without further ado, Guilty Until Proven Innocent, or a story about human nature, trust, risk management, and mindset maintenance. So as I said, when I first started working more in detail with data integrity, the first MHRA guide had just been published, and this was followed by a number or increasing number of warning letters and inspection reports around data integrity. And surely, as it was mentioned, by the end of last year, data integrity was or had become the buzzword of 2016. And all the, or most regulatory bodies had published their interpretation of data integrity by the end of last year. And though it is not necessarily restricted to electronic or computerized systems and equally applies to paper or analog systems, the focus has certainly been on electronic systems. So what have we done when we first saw these guidances come out? We looked at our current procedures and systems, and we then developed a more precise set of policies and standards around these new guidances. We made sure that we had management involved visibly at the highest level, so that we had this high-level buy-in for the process. We also rolled out some very basic training to ensure that everyone was talking about the same things and using the same terminologies and kind of had the same common understanding of the subject matter. And this was all to set the focus to what was to come next. And through this process, we started to realize that, of course, we have to segregate permissions to ensure that data cannot be modified. And, of course, to really ensure that data cannot be altered or deleted, that we have to set certain specific controls in place. And at every step of the way, we kept asking the question, what can people do here to compromise integrity? So we started off by developing a questionnaire to serve as qualitative risk assessment of data integrity risk. And this was a binary exercise, so either we identified a gap and it required action, or there was no need for action. And through this, we assessed all our computerized systems, and this was discussed with QA and QC management. So what did we like about this process? What we liked was that we now had a standardized way to assess all our systems. We liked that all the people involved had a big learning curve. They learned a lot through this process, and they gained a deeper understanding into the subject matter. And it allowed us to quickly identify areas that needed action, but it also allowed us to identify topics that were more overarching and needed resolution on a more global level. But we also realized that this qualitative approach was subjective in itself, because it would change with the growing understanding of the people performing the assessment. So the more that we would learn, the more that we would talk about things and discuss certain things in the subject matter specific to the systems, our perception of the gaps and what was deemed to be a gap and not changed. And also the lack of a quantifiable risk didn't allow us to do risk prioritization, risk reduction, and ultimately risk acceptance. So how did we evolve? Based on the experiences we gathered through this qualitative assessment, we now wanted to build a risk assessment process that was quantifiable, objective, but most importantly, actionable. So what we did is we took into account our experience, and we took into account what measures we can take to reduce data integrity risk. And based on those possible measures, we then built an FMEA risk assessment to take into account these different possible measures. And in the heart of FMEA, of course, there are failure modes, and that's how we started. So we looked at the data life cycle, and we looked at these different stages from sample preparation to data acquisition, to data processing, data reporting, data review, and ultimately data retention. And for every step, we tried to identify failure modes. And again, we were asking the question, what can people do here to compromise integrity? So how did we build this FMEA risk assessment? So our first thought was data integrity failure modes are inherently more severe than other failure modes that we might encounter. So to simplify the process, we chose not to have a low severity, which makes it easier. Now we have just two choices. And we based severity on what the data is used for later on that the failure mode can impact. So for a medium severity, there would be a failure mode that impacts data that is not used to support any material release. Whereas a high severity would be a failure mode impacting data that does support material release. And this, of course, severity is is the only parameter that cannot be influenced by any actions we take short of removing the failure mode altogether and therefore the risk. Now, for likelihood of occurrence, we distinguished between computerized systems and paper systems. And for computerized systems, we first asked ourselves the question, so what can influence the likelihood of occurrence? And we started off with permission levels. And the idea behind this is a failure mode that is inherently more likely to occur the more widely spread the permissions are that allow that failure mode to happen. So at the same time, a failure mode that requires action of only one of a few highly trained administrators is less likely to occur than a failure mode that can be performed by anyone. We also wanted to take into account the element of intent here. So a failure mode that requires someone to intentionally violate data integrity is less likely to occur than a failure mode that can happen by accident. So this allowed us to create this matrix, and we then scored the different combinations from low to medium to high risk or to high likelihood of occurrence. And this allows us to control or to change the likelihood of occurrence by changing the permission levels or by removing the possibility for accidental manipulation. Of course, for paper systems, we do not have permissions. And to kind of show that, we don't have a low likelihood of occurrence. And the thinking behind this is now, because we lack this additional level of permission control, failure modes on analog paper-based systems are more likely to occur than the ones that we can control through permissions. And then we looked at medium likelihood of occurrence where we have well-defined processes in place, and again, for the failure mode to occur, it would require intentionally going against those procedures. And high likelihood of occurrence is where we don't have well-defined procedures or no procedures at all to kind of control, and therefore a failure mode can again happen accidentally. And this, of course, is in line with the element of intent that we introduced for the computerized systems. Which leaves us to detectability. And here we try to make it very black and white, and we decided to focus on mechanisms. So obviously detectability is switched around, so high detectability is good in this case. A high detectability would mean that we have mechanisms in place to detect the event every single time it happens, certainly before batch or material release. A medium detectability would be we have mechanisms in place to detect the event, eventually, periodically, but we cannot ensure that that happens before material or batch release. And of course, the lowest detectability and therefore the highest risk is where we don't have any mechanisms in place to detect the event in the first place. And then with like every risk assessment tool out there, this allows us now to quantifiably define the level of acceptable risk. So we can define what score we accept as an acceptable risk. We can then calculate the score by multiplying the different factors, and we can then define actions to mitigate any risk that is above the acceptable level. Then we can recalculate the score, taking into account the measures that we have taken, and we can repeat this process until the risk is either reduced below the acceptable level, or we formally accept it through a management process. And this gives us the framework to then consistently assess the risk to data integrity and to perform standardized reassessments as the systems and processes change and evolve, which eventually will happen because we need to continue evolving and changing. Now, what happened when we rolled out this concept? And again, we sat down with subject matter experts, we looked at the data flow, and we asked, how can you compromise data integrity here? How can you compromise data integrity here? And we were faced with a set of comments and reactions that were quite uniform all across the organization. We would not do that. It never happened. It could not happen with us or in our area. Why are we considered to be guilty until we can prove that we're innocent? How can we work if we do not trust our coworkers or our staff? Why do we have to assume that people cheat or falsify? And we quickly realized that we have to deal with one very central question when it comes to data integrity risk assessments, and that is, how much quote-unquote criminal energy or intent do we have to assume to properly assess data integrity? And of course, this is a complex question, and we have to take into account that most data integrity risk derives from accidental corruption of data and not intentional corruption of data. We also have to take into account that most safeguards we put in place are to address those accidental corruptions and not intentional falsification. But it's also important for us as companies to realize that we do not have to assume guilt, that we definitely have to trust our staff and our coworkers. But we also have to realize that we have the luxury to get to know them. We have the luxury to know how they work, how their mindset is. We have the luxury to understand how they work, think, and act. So we have to realize that our trust is not just a given, but it's earned. It's earned over time. It's earned through experience. And this is where I think the clash occurs, because any good auditor, be it internal or external, also wants to assume good. But he doesn't really have the time to properly assess and understand culture or mindset. So he can really only guess that through his observations, he will be able to make a more educated guess. And this is why there is an assumption of guilt. In the lack of any evidence, auditors need to rely on testing our systems and processes to ensure that we are properly equipped to prevent as much corruption as we can and have the proper systems and processes in place to detect and manage it, should it ever happen. And this is where it's good to understand a little bit about human nature. So, human nature, this is the fraud triangle. I'm sure you have seen it in one way, shape, or form. Consists of pressure, rationalization, and opportunity. And I always felt like this is lacking the element of detection to some extent. So we have now pressure, rationalization, opportunity, and detection. And I understand, and I felt the same way, fraud sounds harsh. But I feel like this framework does apply to any human interaction and decision-making process. So if you take pressure, every situation, every decision that we take has a certain set of pressures, incentives, and motivations that we have to take one decision over another. Now, I want you all to think of a situation where you decided not to do something because you had like a gut feeling that it would have been wrong. I would like you to think of a situation, though, that is not clear-cut criminal or clear-cut illegal, but something more in the realms of the, let's say, moral gray area. So I won't call you out, don't worry. So if you all have that, so think of that situation, and now let's just change one of these parameters. So let's just now change your motivation or your pressure or your incentives. Let's say that I offer you a huge financial incentive to change your mind and do the other thing that you've had a gut feeling might not be right. Let's say I offer you twice your annual salary or 4 times your annual salary. Would you change your mind? And of course, we reject the notion that we could be influenced by financial incentives for our moral choices, but what if it was a different type of pressure? What if it was life or death? Would you change your mind? Would you take a different decision then? Same way, every single situation we rationalize. I know I'm speeding, but I need to get there in time. The streets are clear, it's going to be fine. So I rationalize my choice to go against the rules. I know I'm not allowed to park here, but I really need to get something out of the shop real quick. It will only take a second. Or for all you guys out there that don't drive, I need to cross the road. The next crosswalk is 400 meters that way. I don't really feel walking over there. I just need to cross the street real quick. There are no cars. I can see clearly. It's going to be fine. So we do this. We rationalize. We rationalize our decisions. With any decision, we can control for certain things, and we can put mechanisms in place that don't allow us to take that path. So say your car, maybe taking Tesla and looking forward a couple of years, automatically detects speed limits and doesn't allow you to exceed the speed limit. You don't have that choice, so you cannot take the choice. Similarly, structural barriers in the middle of the street would not allow you to cross the street where it's not allowed. Which brings us ultimately to the detection. Chances are you're not going to speed if you know your speed is recorded and impacts your insurance premiums. Or chances are you're not going to cross the street where you're not allowed to with a policeman standing next to you. So detection does influence how we decide to act. Now, of course, we're talking about data integrity and not the human mind, which is a completely different and very interesting topic. So let's see how this would apply to data integrity. We have pressure. To us, that translates into management, the sets of pressures we establish. We have rationalization, which translates into mindset of people, company culture. The detection is the processes that we put in place to detect certain events at certain times. And the opportunity is our systems. What do our systems allow our users to do? So that's how we decide or define that. And now if we flip this around, we get to what I like to call the data integrity risk pyramid. We have wrong button. We have mindset and management at the bottom, and we have processes and systems at the top. And there is a clear foundation to this. So our mindset and our management are the foundation which we build everything upon. As Michael mentioned, the people are the most critical and the more difficult things. It's slow and difficult to change, but it's the most important thing we have. And that's what we build our processes and systems upon. Now, these are the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, because they're relatively quick to change, relatively quick to address. And that's where we like to spend most of our time, because we see an issue, we understand the systems, and we want to change those systems. Now, it's comfortable because we understand it. We know how to manage it, and we know how to deal with it. We can ensure that all our equipments are qualified and validated for the intended use. We can ensure that all our procedures are validated. We can then ensure that the right sample is always used with the right equipment at the right time, following the right procedures. We can have quality oversight through all this process, but we cannot forget that if we neglect the foundation, all the actions that we put up in here might be in vain. So, if you have struggled in the past with the same questions and reactions that we have, with the aversion to this whole guilty until proven innocent concept, if you had similar feedback, chances are your mindset is not that bad to begin with. Chances are your culture is good. And it's important to realize that with any good systems, we need to ensure that those systems evolve and grow with the challenges and with the new requirements and technologies that arise. And this can really only be achieved if the people understand the changes that are coming. Good mindset requires maintenance to keep up to date and to keep functioning. This is a concept we like to call mindset management, mindset maintenance. And this is why we have then also introduced our plan to mindset maintenance, if you like. So we designed a training system that aims to cover everyone in the organization. It is a 4-tier training system, and it's designed to be interactive and case-based, to bring real cases applicable to everyone so people understand the challenges and important rules that we are facing now. And it's increasing with complexity based on the subject matter that, and the function that the people do. And we also made sure that we train the trainers and we train auditors so that we have a good knowledge base on every site that people can rely and go back to. And finally, I guess data integrity risks are like icebergs. They can very well sink your ship if you're not prepared. And they are really hard to judge, if not impossible to judge, from the heights of the captain's desk. So it's important to understand that for us to understand and get a feeling for culture and mindset, we need to look under the surface. We need to look under the surface to understand mindset and culture. But it's also crucial for us to understand that to truly manage our risk, we have to assume that we will encounter a dangerous iceberg once in a while. Ultimately, the only thing we can do is ensure that we have a crew that we can trust and equip that crew with the right processes to avoid as much danger as they can, but also equip them with procedures to deal with the remaining risk. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention.